I had an experience that I think may be of interest to you. This happened when I was 14 years old and living in a trailer park near the Oregon coast. At the time, I lived with my mother, who worked at a local restaurant as well as attending college part-time. She often worked late into the night, leaving me alone until she got home around midnight or so. This particular evening, it was winter, and it was raining pretty hard outside. If you know anything about the Oregon winters, well, we don't get a whole lot of snow, depending on where you are, but for most of the state, at least in the upper part, it's 40 degrees and rain all winter. My mom left for work after dinner, around 6:30 in the evening, and told me not to stay up too late because school wasn't canceled. The trailer we lived in had aluminum siding, which made quite a bit of noise during heavy rainstorms like this one. However, there were no leaks or other issues. Now, as usual on nights when my mother would work late, I stayed up watching TV until about 11 p.m. before going back into my bed. My room faced out towards the road where all of our neighbors' trailers were located. The streetlights would always cast these shadows across everything, making it difficult to see anything clearly from inside without turning on additional lights. Now, at some point between falling asleep while reading comics under the covers using a flashlight, something woke me suddenly. It took me a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but then I saw a figure standing just beyond my window, staring directly at me. The first thing I noticed is how pale his skin looked against the dark background of trees behind him. It seemed almost white. His hair also appeared very light in color, though I couldn't tell if it was blonde or gray. He wore what appeared to be a pair of jeans that fit loosely over his legs, giving the impression he might have been wearing multiple layers. The shirt he wore hung down low enough to cover most of his upper body. Now, I couldn't make out any details about his face since I could only see his profile, but I remember being struck by the fact that it didn't seem right somehow. Maybe the proportions were not correct, or perhaps his head shape seemed off. It's hard to say exactly why I felt the way I did. His arms hung straight at his sides while his hands dangled below his waist level. It looked like he might have been holding something, but I couldn't be sure due to the darkness. It was several moments before he moved, which made me very uncomfortable. I wasn't sure what his intentions were, or if he was even a real person. After a while, I decided that he probably was just some guy who had gotten lost trying to find a friend's trailer, since there was always new people moving into the park all the time without knowing where they were going. I was also aware of reports about drug activity nearby, so I thought maybe this could be someone looking to score drugs from one of the dealers living in the area, though I never witnessed anything myself. With these thoughts in mind, I turned over in bed, hoping he would soon go away and leave me alone. I wanted nothing more than to go back to sleep as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, though, it seemed like hours passed before I passed out, only to wake up the next morning feeling exhausted. I told my mom what had happened when she got home later that day, but she didn't seem to take it seriously and said it was probably just a dream caused by too much TV before bed. However, I know the difference between dreams and reality, and this was definitely not a dream. Now, I've tried to forget the incident over the years, but recently, I stumbled upon your YouTube and stories about similar encounters involving these pale beings called crawlers, and it brought back all these memories. So, I wanted to write this for you. Now, I'm a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I've never had any experiences that would lead me to believe in ghosts, aliens, or anything else of that nature. They're generally based on evidence and reason. Now, that being said, this particular experience has stuck with me because I can't explain it away as a dream or imagination playing tricks on me. It felt very real and was so vivid. I still remember every detail about what this gaunt figure looked like. I don't know if what I saw was maybe a kind of supernatural entity trying to mask itself as an actual person, or just a strange dude who happened to be wandering around. But either way, it definitely left an impression on me. If you have any thoughts about what this might have been, or if maybe you've heard similar stories from other people, please let me know. I'd love to hear your insights. I look forward to anything you or your audience may provide. I live in Oregon, and I have a very strange story I wanted to tell you. This happened back in 2009, when my family and I were living near the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. I was 15 years old at this time, but I remember it like it was yesterday. It was somewhere in the late summer, early fall of that year. My father had taken me out hunting with him on our property. We owned about 40 acres, which backed up against national forest land. My dad had gone off further into the woods than me, as we always did this for safety reasons. So there I am, sitting on a stump, watching for deer or elk as they came down from higher elevations through our property. The sun is setting, so visibility isn't great anymore. It's getting colder too, especially since we're already pretty high up elevation-wise. I'm just standing around now because it's hard to see anything while seated anymore. Suddenly, something moves behind some bushes not far away, maybe 20 feet at most. The way this thing moved wasn't natural though. It seemed really stiff and jerky. Reminded me of a stop-motion animation. Well, after seeing that movement, I thought maybe one of my brothers was deciding to mess with me or something, so I call out, "Hey guys, knock it off!" No response. Now I'm thinking, okay, if that's not them, then what else could be here? My mind races and immediately goes to bears or cougars. And being alone suddenly makes things feel much more dangerous. And I'm feeling very vulnerable. So I'm starting to get scared at this point. Then, whatever is hiding behind those bushes decides it's going to show itself. And boy, does he make an entrance. This creature, because I don't know what else to call it, comes barreling through these shrubs, making all sorts of racket. It's thrashing about everywhere, and then finally, he emerges completely. He stands up on two legs. He has dark brown fur covering his entire body. His head looks wolf-like, with pointed ears sticking straight up atop his head. Instantly, everything inside tells me this ain't no bear or cougar. I mean, I was scared before, but now I am terrified. I could remember the blood draining from my face. And so I start yelling for my father, not knowing what else to do. "Dad! Dad!" But no response. I could hear him off in the distance shooting his rifle, though. So this werewolf, I guess I would call it, is just standing there looking at me. Now, I'm not sure if he's trying to decide whether I would be a good meal or what, but he takes one step towards me, and that's when I bolt. I ran as fast as possible back down the hill toward our house, and soon enough, I made it home safely. It never did follow me. My father had come out of the woods shortly after that, so that's my story. I'm sorry I don't have any more details, but once my dad came, I never told him about what I saw. Although I did tell him I thought a large black bear was nearby. Thanks for reading, and if you go out in the woods, be safe. I have listened to a number of your videos, particularly about Mothman sightings around Point Pleasant in West Virginia. Well, I wanted to share with you an experience that I had with what seemed like a similar entity when I was young. I grew up on a farm near Scioto, Oregon, located in Lynn County. This was during the early 1980s. One evening while we were eating dinner, my father looked out our dining room window, which faced west towards our pasture land, and said, what is that?" We all turned around to look at what he was pointing at. As it started flying away from us into some trees next to one of our fields, it became very clear this thing wasn't any kind of bird or bat. Its wings were leathery looking, and they didn't flap but glided, as if there might be arms attached inside of them. It also had more than 2 legs, because as its body twisted slightly back and forth with each wing beat, we could see several pairs moving under its abdomen. It was bizarre. It flew behind some large fir trees along the edge of the field before vanishing from view. My brother, in reaction to this, went and grabbed his .22 rifle and ran outside, hoping for another glimpse, but never saw anything again after that. Now, about 3 weeks goes by, and someone reports seeing something crash into Still Lake, which is only about 5 miles east-northeast from where we lived. Now, I don't know if anyone ever went out there to investigate further. The whole area around Still Lake is private property owned by Weyerhaeuser Timber Company, so maybe nobody else even heard about it happening. Now, I strictly believe that this was nothing else other than the supernatural. I have seen nothing like it before or since. There were also some other strange things going on around our farm at this time. It made me think about that, but those were things that were going on within our home. Just generic paranormal activity. I almost wonder if they were related at all. Anyway, sorry this isn't much information, just thought you might find it interesting considering everything going on in the world nowadays. I was in my early 20s when this happened. I lived with my mother and sister, who were both at work that day. We lived in a small town outside of Eugene, Oregon, on the outskirts of some forested areas. My room is upstairs next to the front door, so you could see out into our yard from there. It was summertime and hot as heck, so I went outside to smoke a cigarette because we don't allow smoking indoors. Now, as soon as I stepped off of our porch, something felt really wrong. But it took me about halfway down the driveway before realizing what it was. All sound had stopped completely. Now, I've been around animals enough to know that if they're quiet, then there's probably something nearby scaring them or hunting them. And we have cougars up here. That alone made me very nervous. But since we didn't have any neighbors within sight distance, not seeing anything put me more at ease than there had been people around. Anyway, like an idiot, after having figured out why everything suddenly went silent for no reason other than danger being present somewhere close by, instead of going back inside immediately like anyone else would do, even though nothing seemed dangerous about where I was standing, nope, not this guy. I kept walking further away from safety towards the road, just beyond which are trees blocking most viewpoints unless someone happens to be driving by. So now, imagine yourself sitting alone in your car while reading a book, waiting for your lover, sister, dad, whoever to show up, just killing time until they show up. It's important to understand how easy it would be for anyone driving through here to easily become disoriented without knowing due east, west, north, south directions anymore, depending on various factors like weather. Now, suddenly, out of nowhere appears this thing. Now, let's try explaining what this thing looks like, shall we? It's about 5'10" to 6 feet tall. I say about because it's hard to tell when its front legs are much longer than the back ones. So that throws off my estimate of height a bit. It has no tail and walks on all fours. Its head is shaped more like an upside-down teardrop or pear shape, with 2 eyes that appear very human-like. But there's something very wrong with them. They don't look right somehow. Maybe they're too big for the size of its face. They're not glowing or anything, just large-looking eyeballs. The skin covering this thing appears mostly hairless, except for some tufts here and there around elbows, knees, and shoulders. This is making me think it might be sickly in some way. though that doesn't explain why those areas have any fur at all. Its coloration reminded me somewhat of our own flesh tone, only a lighter grayish-white hue instead of being nearly pink, if you can imagine such a thing. Now comes the strangest part. While watching this bizarre humanoid quadruped, I observed it slowly making its way across the road towards the other side. Here, trees continued to block viewpoints from the driver's perspective. This obstruction was particularly noticeable unless one was actually driving through these wood roads during daylight hours, especially considering how dense these woods really are. I'm thinking, what the heck? Why would anyone walk around out here dressed up in what looks like some sort of strange outfit? Then another thought crosses my mind. If someone were wearing a suit, then wouldn't their arms, hands, or fingers move differently than natural animals walking in an upright posture? Yes. So that was definitely not a person inside a weird costume trying to scare passerby drivers. So now I'm thoroughly confused by whatever it is standing a few feet away from where I am smoking a cigarette next to the driveway leading to the house. Now keep this in mind, please. Earlier, I mentioned sound having stopped completely after stepping off the porch walking down the driveway. So you'd think that if this thing were to make any noise at all, then I would have heard it approaching. Well, no. Not even the slightest sound from those large human-like feet touching the ground anywhere near me could be heard. And that's when things got even more weird. It just keeps coming towards the road without ever looking my way once, despite standing so close by where I am smoking. How can it not see or smell me? Now I'm scared beyond belief because whatever it is must be either blind and or deaf for not having noticed my presence. That makes no sense whatsoever given how quiet everything became earlier, along with the fact its eyes looked perfectly normal otherwise, meaning they're definitely not clouded over like cataracts or anything similar that would cause vision impairment. Now at this point, I decide it's better to go back inside the house before something bad happens. But I don't want to turn around and walk away in case it turns its head, notices me, and makes eye contact, which, for all I know, could provoke aggressive behavior leading to an attack. I mean, after all, I don't know its intentions. I stood there frozen solid, trying to figure out what I was going to do next, as fear gripped tightly around me, making it difficult to breathe properly since my lungs felt constricted and my heart was beating out of my chest. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then suddenly, I realized two very important details. If someone were wearing a suit or animal costume, what was their purpose? And why hasn't it made a single noise the entire time I've been watching it approach the road directly in front of me? So many questions racing through my brain faster than neurons could fire the synapses to connect them together, let alone logical reasoning processing necessary for understanding the true nature of this. Now, why does existence have to become so complicated? Is there some hidden agenda going on here involving these creatures, waiting to strike on unsuspecting victims? We don't know. Why do things like this happen when we least expect them to? What purpose could it serve, if any at all, other than to cause confusion, fear, and doubt among those who witness such strange encounters firsthand? Now, I'm not sure how long I stood there watching this thing slowly cross the road towards the trees, but once it did, that was it. It did eventually disappear into the underbrush, and it left me alone, standing there. I felt completely bewildered by what had just happened. After that, I went inside and didn't speak about it to anyone. And in fact, I've kept this story in for a long time. This is really the first time I'm opening up about it because it's so strange. Now, as far as what I saw, I have no idea. My brother and I were playing outside our house in a very rural area. Our very large backyard was surrounded by forest and trees on 3 sides, with the front facing the street where we lived. It was summer vacation from school, and we were enjoying our time as kids. About 4 p.m. rolls around, and my older brother suddenly exclaimed. He pointed to an object descending from the sky at about treetop level. The object appeared round, but it descended fast through some trees. I couldn't clearly discern its shape. My first thought was that this thing was going to crash into us, and so my heart started racing. But then something puzzling happened. Just before it hit ground level, which would have been right next to us, the craft seemed to vanish completely out of existence. I stood there for several seconds, staring at nothing, feeling confused and thinking, what just happened? Now suddenly, my brother's voice broke through, screaming. Now when I turned toward him, I saw his face turn white with fear. He yelled again, "Look over there!" Pointing behind me in another direction, slightly away from where we had originally spotted this UFO, this new location was about 30 yards away near one edge of our yard against some more trees. Curiosity had caused me to hesitate, wondering why he wanted me to look elsewhere. Then, hearing his scream loudly, I instantly spun around, fully alert and scanning for danger. At once, everything came together, forming a clear image in my head of what had just occurred. Now, I gotta be honest here. I'm not exactly sure how to explain this, but I'm gonna tell you what I saw. I saw a tall, reptilian-looking humanoid standing directly next to a silently landed craft. It was approximately 8 feet tall, dark green scaly skin, and large, deep red eyes that seemed very intelligent. It held a strange weapon that resembled a staff or a spear of some kind. I can't even describe it. There were other small beings around it that looked similar but different. Neither of them looked near as imposing as this individual. The most disturbing part was their movement. They didn't walk on 2 legs. They actually kind of slithered and glided across the ground. Kind of like a snake, but not like a snake. It's so hard to describe. It's really challenging to accurately put into words what we witnessed due to the lack of proper words to convey such a strange experience into human language. So try to imagine seeing something similar, then multiply the fear by 10, maybe 100 times more than normal, and add confusion and disbelief. I'm sorry for writing all this down, but the next thing we know, we both wake up and we're in the same field, and time has passed. We have these strange burn marks along our arms, and we can't explain it. A few days later, the pain goes away, but my mom just thought we had played with lighters or something. I don't know, it was a strange experience. I've told this to a few other paranormal researchers who believe that we were abducted and experimented on, but I'm not exactly sure. It was a very, very strange experience. Anyway, thank you again. I want to tell you about an experience I had when I was 16. This happened in a small town just outside of Eugene called Cresswell. It's pretty rural, surrounded by farms and forests. My mother drove me to school every morning, as we lived out in the country at the time. I went to high school, which started early, so it was still dark outside when my mom picked me up from home. One day, while driving through, which consisted of several streets, we noticed these strange figures standing near the edge. They were streetlights nearby, but they didn't provide much light because there were trees lining both sides of the road. The first thing that struck us as odd was what these people looked like. They appeared around 12 to 14 years of age. It seemed strange for kids this age to be out alone before dawn, especially considering there weren't any bus stops around. We also noticed their strange clothing or uniforms. They wore long cloaks with hoods pulled over their heads, and they all stood perfectly still, facing forward, staring straight ahead. As soon as our headlights hit them, they turned towards us simultaneously. It was almost robotic in motion. All 3 had completely black eyes. No whites whatsoever. These eyes reflected light just like those of cats. What made this even stranger was how wide open their eyelids were. This created a really creepy effect because it looked so unnatural. After making eye contact with them, my mom quickly screamed, accelerated past, and a few seconds later she stopped, backed up so we could see if they had moved. Well, two of them remained motionless, while one walked slowly across the street right behind our car. Once he passed, he stopped again directly behind where his companions stood. When we arrived back home later on, after dropping me off at school, she told her husband, who said not to worry. He thought someone might have just been playing a prank. But neither my mother nor her husband believed that it was a prank due to how real everything felt. Oh, by the way, I don't have a good relationship with my stepfather, so I just refer to him as my mom's husband. Anyway, I guess that's kind of irrelevant. I've never heard of the black-eyed kids until just a few years ago when I had read a Reddit story about them online. And after looking a little more, I guess it's a pretty somewhat common phenomenon. But now that I'm older and wiser, it really takes me back and makes me wonder what would have happened if we had stopped the car, or even worse, let one of them in. Hey there. I'm a longtime listener of all your YouTubes, and I love it. Thank you so much for sharing everything you do. I felt it was time to step forward and share an experience from me when I was 15. My family lived outside of Portland, Oregon, having moved there from the Midwest several months before this happened. I spent most of my summer exploring the woods near our home, either with friends or by myself. The area was pretty densely wooded, interspersed with patches of meadows. There were also numerous trails leading into other various parts of the woods. Some areas were difficult to access just due to the thick underbrush that would occur in the spring and summer. Now, on one day in particular, while hiking along a trail that led up towards an open field that I loved to play in, I noticed what appeared to be a large black dog moving through the brush roughly 100 feet away from me. The animal appeared agitated, circling around as if looking for something or someone. Now, in Oregon, we have plenty of deer, elk, black bears, but seeing any type of canine is unusual, as coyotes are not always prevalent here as back east, and if they are, they're not in this part of Portland, at least not to this degree, and we certainly don't have large black wolves. Anyway, a few minutes go by, and another similar-sized black dog emerged from another part of the thicket and begins running circles around its companion. Now, at first, this is confusing, I get it. These animals looked like wolves due to their size. Much larger, actually. In fact, both of them, they sort of resembled black Alaskan Malamutes, although they weren't quite as stocky. And it became apparent that these two canines might be feral. I didn't see any collars or any inkling that they were owned by anyone. Now, they continued circling each other until suddenly, both stopped abruptly after hearing something beyond my range. One runs off into thicker cover while the other stayed behind, cautiously watching whatever approached. Now, about 5 minutes passes when 3 people walk out into the clearing. 2 men wearing flannel shirts, carrying rifles over their shoulder. The third person, appearing female based on her clothing style and body structure, also held a rifle slung across her shoulder. Observing them for a while, it became obvious that she wasn't comfortable holding the weapon. Gun ownership is relatively common in some parts of Oregon, so seeing people with firearms wasn't unusual. However, this was a public area, and there were laws against discharging weapons unless for specific reasons like hunting or self-defense. Now, at that point, I decided to leave the area, as these individuals might be breaking the law. I took off running down the trail towards my home, but stopped when I heard one of them men yell loudly, followed by what sounded like an animal yelping, then growling. I turned around and saw the 2 large black dogs chasing me through the woods. The speed at which they closed the distance seemed impossible given the thick underbrush, yet they maneuvered effortlessly. It didn't take long before both animals caught up with me, and we tumbled together in a clearing near the edge of the field. One dog pinned me down while the other stood nearby, watching. A man approached, holding a rifle across his chest. He said nothing as he moved closer, standing over me. As soon as he raised the weapon above his head, another person appeared from behind, striking him on the back, causing him to fall forward and knock out completely. The second guy quickly grabbed the gun, then yelled something at the female who ran away into the brush. She never returned. After tying up the unconscious man, the other guy released his hold on the dog, allowing it to run free. Instead of leaving, he sat beside the remaining wolf-like canine, and soon after being freed from its grip, I noticed the collar worn by the first contained several metal spikes protruding outward, giving it the appearance of some type of spiked medieval armor. Anyway, though still concerned about my safety, I tried to calm myself and remain quiet, hoping it might resolve without further incident. The two guys argued amongst themselves, eventually leaving the clearing along different paths, each carrying a rifle. Meanwhile, I sat quietly next to the feral-looking hound, not knowing whether I should stay put or attempt an escape. While a few minutes later, a third individual emerged. She looked exhausted, covered in dirt and leaves, probably as a result of hiding. Despite her disheveled appearance, she seemed harmless, so I remained seated, hoping she wouldn't notice. She walked over to where the dog sat, then began speaking softly, and soon after released the animal, which ran off without looking back. After watching her for several minutes, I decided to approach her since she didn't seem dangerous. It turned out this person was a camp counselor from a nearby youth retreat who told me about a local legend involving these woods. According to the story, hellhounds would drive out unfaithful suitors if they entered the location. Maybe there was some truth to the tale because the dogs appeared to be guarding something. Now, we talked for a while until we agreed to walk out together to the main trail leading back to town. During our conversation, I learned that she and her two male companions were part of a group responsible for maintaining a summer program teaching kids survival skills and camping techniques. Apparently, their organization had been using the area for years despite occasional run-ins. The counselor also mentioned how locals warn them to stay away from certain parts of the forest due to unknown dangers, including aggressive wildlife and possible cult activity. Now, I asked whether she thought those guys might have belonged to one of these groups, but she dismissed the idea, saying they were most likely just poachers trying to hunt deer illegally. Now, based on my own observations, I suspected otherwise, but I didn't want to press the issue. Instead, we continued walking, eventually reaching the point where our paths diverged. As I said goodbye, I felt strange, knowing things might not end well, especially considering the earlier events. Wondering whatever happened to those people and animals made me feel strange for the rest of the day. Mostly, I stayed home, avoiding the trails for the next few weeks. It's been 30 years since this happened, and I get it. It probably sounds incredibly strange, but that's because it is. I still remember every detail as if it had happened yesterday. Now, I never heard anything regarding missing persons reports or illegal hunting incidents around that time, so maybe everything turned out okay. I still wonder occasionally whether urban legends hold any validity based on personal experiences like mine.